Hello everyone, this is part 16 of What If Naruto was in Anbu at 6, and I hope you guys enjoy this video and to like, to subscribe, to share, and check out the playlist, to see more comment down below. Now let's start the intro.
They call me a god. They call me a god. They call me a god.
Join my membership, the perks are great. It's in the description. 2 days since the second battle of Sakai. One of the guard currently on duty around Konoha's main encampment for the siege was startled as he felt a firm hand grip his shoulder. Looking back behind him, he found Toshiro, the axe-wielding Kiri ninja, standing behind him. The young Junin gave a nod of consent as he watched the man lose some of his tension, the muscles in his arms and legs uncoiling as he allowed himself to drop his guard and place the kunai he had reflexively grabbed back into its proper holster. Go get some rest, it's my shift now. The guard nodded, yes sir. He spoke respectfully before he inclined his head in a slight bow. Toshiro sat down, preparing for the long shift, trying not to think of the wounded state of his father. While he knew that his father was not invincible, it was still very disheartening to see him so injured. His father was one of the strongest men he knew after all. He let his eyes travel to the sky above, judging by the coming dawn, orange and purple hues decorating the horizon over Iwa's jagged peaks. He could assume that it was somewhere between 5:30 and 6. He would have a shift until about 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock where the next person would take up the shift. The crisp morning air, blanketed with the deep morning fog from the high mountains. Toshiro wasn't really used to fog. Mist was moist and could be warm in the right conditions. Fog had a more dry feeling, more humid, and was just downright cold. The young Junin oftentimes wondered how the Iwa shinobi could deal with it at this altitude. Though he must admit it must do wonders for endurance training. The air was much thinner here than what it was in Kiri, meaning that their endurance could easily be halved if they didn't know how to deal with such an environment. Most of the ninja that were assigned to this assault had received a crash course in breathing and minor chakra control techniques to assist them in managing the thin air while their be adjusted properly. Toshiro slowly sat back, leaning his head against the wall. For the last 2 days, there had been little activity on both sides of the wall, both merely patrolling their respective lines and making sure no one tried to pull one thing over the other's eyes. But, as Toshiro sat around for a bit longer, he noticed that just beyond the morning fog faint, shadowy silhouettes could be seen. His eyes narrowed as he slowly stood, forcing his eyes to pierce through the ghostly veil. As the sun rose over the hills, and light descended down, dispelling the shadows, Toshiro's eyes widened as he came across the sight of what must have been nearly the entire Iwa army. Over the wall, and practically at the doorstep. He looked to the other guard towers and scouting points, finding Iwa shinobi at them instead. He could even see the slightly distinguished forms of what seemed like grey lumps, possibly be near them. Sensing a presence behind him, he reacted instantly. Turning, and fluidly catching knife and wrist, the attacker having been aiming for his K, judging by the angle his hand was at. Toshiro cursed before immediately rushing off to sound the alarm. Iwa had caught them with their pants down. Definitely not a good thing. Yoshihiro smirked, watching the young Kiri ninja flee the scene. Hey, so we weren't able to get them all, then? Not a moment later, bells were rung throughout the Leaf camp before them. He pulled the scope from his eyes. Looking to his Junin next to him, he spoke up. Well, they aren't just gonna commit S for ya. Move. He yelled out the order so that it was carried over the assembled group of ninja, and in silence they all vanished. A moment later, cries were heard coming from the Konoha camp, the sound of metal clashing against metal following shortly behind. He smirked, letting his eyes travel to Temari and Toyohisa. The two had remained behind, acting as bodyguards to make sure no one else attempted any other assassinations. You two really should join the battle. Surprise attacks are good for you, seeing the enemy get out of their tents, confused, disoriented and sometimes, but is certainly not a sight you'll get to see many times. Temari's nose wrinkled in distaste at the joke. No thank you, guarding an old man is just fine by me. She shot back, smirking at Yoshihiro's snort. Toyohisa shook his head. Uncle, you know very well that I didn't even want to bring you out into the field. I sure as hell am not going to leave you here alone for any other attempt on your life to be carried out. Yoshihiro shook his head and was about to tell his mother hen of a nephew that he was perfectly capable of taking care of himself when pressure built up in his sea and he released a hacking cough, placing a fist over his mouth as he tried to suppress more coughs as they flowed up from his lungs. After about 10 seconds, Temari started to get a bit concerned, placing a hand on the older man's armored back. Hey, are you alright, uncle? Toyohisa questioned. I cough fine. The older managed to gasp out unconvincingly as more coughs escaped his lips, becoming violent as he hunched forward, placing his free hand to grasp Toyohisa in order to hold himself up. Hey, Toyohisa-san, I think we need to get him back to the medics or something. Temari cried out in alarm as the older man's coughing got visibly worse, and he actually sounded like he was hacking up something a lot redder than mucus. Yoshihiro fell to one knee, Temari and Toyohisa grabbing him by his armpits to stop him from falling completely. Finally, after almost another 30 seconds of the older man's violent coughing, it finally s down, allowing both the Tsuchikage and the other two to breathe easier. Uncle, Toyohisa began uncertainly. You haven't been taking your medication, have you? Medication? Temari thought in silent question, having never heard, or having any inclination at the older man having any condition that required medication. Yoshihiro glared at his loose-tongued nephew before standing. No, I haven't. Those damn cough pills of yours cloud the mind, make me drowsy. Can't afford that in a battle. Bu, the younger man moved to protest when Yoshihiro grabbed him by the scruff of his shirt, pulling him so they were face to face. The old man spoke firmly, and with an edge of graveness to his voice, but with an underlying hint of softness. This is a battlefield, Toyohisa. You just think of the enemies around and in front of you. You can worry about my carcass later, got it? Slowly the younger man nodded and Yoshihiro released him. Looking to Temari, he sent her a silent glare, asking for her to remain very quiet. Catching the older man's look, she understood it and decided it was the interest of her health insurance if she did as he wished. Growling as her knee gave out, she blocked the incoming strike from another ninja with one hand, delivered a quick palm thrust to the man's stomach with her other. The ninja behind her at this point had tossed another kunai, this one aiming for the back of her head. She spun around, throwing her newly acquired kunai at her long-range attacker while simultaneously placing a minor genjutsu over it, his kunai and hers passing right by each other. Catching the kunai aimed at her, she watched as the man tried to do the same. Spinning back around, she plunged the kunai in her hands, upwards into the other man's jaw, watching him give a quick jerk before he fell. The Hyuga heir cursed again as she performed what little medical abilities she had over her wounded leg. She had barely fallen asleep 3 hours ago, having been going over the battle plans with Shino, Tenten and Mika. They were scheduled to attack the Iwa ninja tomorrow, near dusk. She had not expected Iwa would ever launch an attack. Their Tsuchikage was injured, and if the condition of Guan and Kakashi was anything to go by, he wouldn't be back in fighting condition for at least another month. Judging by how strong Yoshihiro was, losing him, even just temporarily, would be an utterly demoralizing blow to the Iwa ninja. Everyone knows that an army whose morale is low is not one that can lead an attack with a great chance of success. They must be desperate to drive them back. And as Naruto had sometimes said, desperation breeds determination. She had made the critical error of underestimating him, and it was costing her. She was merely armed with a single kunai pouch, being the only thing she had been able to put on, and it was no surprise many ninja were in a similar condition. Finishing her healing technique, she moved to stand, growling as her knee shook in weakness as it struggled to hold her upright. She could not afford any handicap, especially one this damning, at this point so early in the battle. Her Byakugan flared and immediately she caught sight of a very familiar ninja. Leaping back, she fell to one knee as she landed. A spinning, shredding cyclone crashing down onto the spot she had been standing on a few minutes earlier. The dust soon cleared, revealing the snarling Kiba, though he held the hints of a smirk on his lips. Hey, no bug-loving freak to save you now, eh? Who says I need saving from a mongrel like you? Hinata shot back in a bored tone, but carried an edge to it, whether that was from anger, or from worry due to her injury wasn't really known. A voice behind her startled her, however. That would be me. Hinata spun around, barely managing to catch a scant glimpse of another spinning form before it s into her at a downward angle, her arm, which had taken the full brunt of the impact, pain racing up and down her arm. She did manage to notice, however, that by the angle her attacker came from, they had used the Byakugan's blind spot to get in that close. She had gotten careless yet again. The fact that no one had used that weakness against her during the recent battles had led her to believe no one in Iwa knew about it, and the fact that Kiba, Sakura, or that other blonde-haired girl she had fought had used it had also led her to believe none of the Konoha refugees knew about it either. Another foolish mistake on her part, especially using Kiba of all people to compare the rest of the Konoha nins that were here. The attack had sent her in Kiba's direction. The Inuzuka boy's hands reared back as he prepared to tear her open with the sharp, natural weapons that were his claws. While she was in mid-air, however, another form suddenly exploded from the ground that was previously beneath Kiba. Hinata's eyes widened as she came across the sight of a second Kiba, no doubt Akamaru, as he lunged for her, claws extended. Spinning around quickly, the familiar, signature barrier of her clan formed around her. Chitin. Akamaru's henge dispelled as the animal was forcefully thrown away, the creature's sharp yelp reaching the ears of those within earshot as he scraped and skidded to a stop on the harsh gravel covering the floor. Hinata groaned from the stress placed on her injured arm. As the barrier around her dissipated, however, she caught sight of Hana. Behind her, a kunai already aimed to strike at her ribs. Hinata struggled to turn, knowing already that it was too late, but refusing to accept defeat lying down. Hana smirked, certain of the Hyuga girl's death, and at least a part of their revenge being accomplished, when Hinata suddenly vanished, and she felt her wrist caught in an iron, unyielding grip. Cursing, the Inuzuka girl froze as her eyes found red and black before her eyes. The slight click as the hand, clad in a metallic, segmented gauntlet, tightened its already powerful grip on her wrist brought her back. Slowly her eyes traveled up, to the form that towered above her. Red cloak billowing in the cold, harsh wind of the high mountains. Sharp, metal face mask covering the bottom half of his features, while the veiled shadow, formed by the hood of his cloak, covered the other half. Burning red eyes stared back into her own as they glowed eerily from the darkness. Hana growled, hiding the fear gripping her as she stared upon this man after a decade, behind a veil of anger, a much more secure emotion by comparison. Kiba's eyes widened, and for a moment, all seemed to freeze. Holding itself perfectly still at the sight of him. Hinata, from her place on the ground, gasped when she saw him. Her commander, clad in his old battle garb. It had been nearly a full 7 years since she had last seen the imposing sight of him in that armor. She had to admit, it was a somewhat strange, bringing both relief and unease. Hana growled as she with her other hand, a trail of chakra flowing from her claw tips, heading for his face. Naruto released her wrist, and with the same arm blocked her incoming strike, meeting his fist with her forearm. Hana screamed as the tough bone was cracked, the sickening sound reaching Naruto's ears. He followed up his attack, with one powerful blow. Young woman C. Hana froze for a moment, before she coughed up hunching over as she fell to her knees, escaping her lips and pulling beneath her. Naruto faintly heard a horn being blown in the distance but paid little attention to it. Sis! Kiba cried out in fear and alarm before he snarled, rushing the hooded ninja in a blind fury. Naruto looked over his shoulder, red eyes glowing eerily as he spoke. Worthless. Hinata's eyes traveled down to his hand, widening in alarm as a familiar ball of chakra formed and spun rapidly in his right hand, red creeping over it before it burst into flame. Get back! She cried to all within earshot before she herself used Shunshin in her attempt to get as far away from the area as possible. Yoshihiro's eyes snapped open as he stood up, a slow feeling of dread creeping down his spine as a chakra, controlled, but certainly powerful, reached his highly tuned senses. Toyohisa turned, sensing the distress in his uncle, something that was very odd. Uncle, what's wrong? He questioned, watching as Temari tensed and placed a hand on her fan as she too sensed the heaviness that settled over the air. Toyohisa. The older man spoke slowly, pausing as he weighed his next words. Call the troops back. The young Shimazu looked visibly startled as he spoke. Why what? But uncle, we have the ad. I said call them back, don't argue. The Tsuchikage roared, knowing that now was not the time for his inexperienced nephew's premature assumptions of their victory. Toyohisa unconsciously stepped back before he nodded once, vanishing in a cloud of smoke, and a second later the horn for the retreat call was blown, and in a scant few seconds Iwa ninja began rushing towards them, most visibly confused and outraged at being ordered to retreat when they held the Konoha ninja at such a key disadvantage. Tsuchikage-sama. One of the Anbu cried out as he landed in front of him. What is the meaning of this? As if waiting for the man's question, a huge explosion shook the ground beneath their feet, and flames roared to life as they engulfed a wide area within the outer city. Buildings crumbled and glasses shattered as the shockwave passed over them. Yoshihiro's eyes narrowed as dust and debris was kicked up, some scant few particles and pebbles smacking against his face as most of the ninja's cries of shock and alarm. That is, Yoshihiro answered rhetorically as Toyohisa appeared next to him, visibly shaken from the degree of destruction that occurred so unexpectedly. Toyohisa. The older man spoke calmly. Take the men and retreat, pull them back behind the wall, I'll stay and act as the rear guard. No, uncle. The young man spoke. Let me, I will stay and you lead the men, you're still too. I'm old, you're young. End of discussion. Toyohisa. Yoshihiro interrupted again, not giving the young man more time to speak. Soon enough, however, next to Temari, Sakura, Shikamaru, Ino and Chuji soon appeared. Each in a puff of smoke and each visibly confused over the situation. What's going on? Ino questioned her fellow blonde. Temari shook her head. I'm not entirely sure, but we're pulling back for now. Looking around, she spoke slowly. Where's Kiba and Hana? Their question was answered, however, as Akamaru landed next to them. Hana hunched over holding onto Kiba and Kiba himself, draped over his dog's back, burns covering much of their forms. Hana was visibly struggling to even keep herself upright. Hana! Sakura cried worriedly at the sight of the older girl so injured. Rushing over, the group helped them get off of Akamaru. Ino and Temari, who were grabbing Kiba, froze, not due to the sheer amount of bee covering his body, or all the burns sustained by the Inuzuka, but by the fact that his right arm was no longer there. From the shoulder down, Kiba was missing his right arm. The two blondes glanced at each other, the gazes filled with a shock and pit forming at the bottom of their stomachs. They both knew that at this point, Kiba's career as a ninja was undoubtedly over. The others, who had also noticed Kiba's dismemberment by now, barely caught the sound of Hana's strained voice as it was breathed from between the older girl's lips. It's him. Cough, he's here. She wheezed out, nearly falling over as Sakura all but held her up. The others looked confused for a brief moment before a dawning realization settled over their eyes. Then, another explosion shook the ground at their feet, the heat making them wince in discomfort as it bit at their skin. Go Toyohisa. They heard Yoshihiro bark. Looking to the older man, they watched as the young man nodded before he turned and began barking out orders. His voice faded out into the background, however, as Yoshihiro turned to them, an understanding passing between their eyes as the Iwa shinobi did as instructed and rushed back over the wall, a scant few remaining behind to act as the rear guard. They looked to the roaring wall of flames, a distance away, watching, waiting for the opponent they each knew was coming. They saw a shadowed figure slowly making its way through the fire, each tensing as the orange and red heat obscured his form. To their surprise, however, an Iwa Anbu came stumbling out, bumping against buildings, debris and overall junk. They could faintly hear the man muttering something, the words becoming clear as he neared them. Aki, Akasho, Akasho, he repeated as he tripped over himself, rushing to get to the Tsuchikage, the one man who could help him, who could defend him from the monstrosity that was behind him. Temari watched the man approach, but soon her eyes drifted back to the flames, watching them flicker for a split second. Her eyes widened as she saw what caused it. Get down! She screamed out, but the man either didn't hear her, or was simply too delirious to register the command. As if sensing his approaching fate, however, he turned sluggishly, his face contorting in fear and horror for a brief second before he was seized to several hundred pieces by what was most likely an equal number of winged blades. Yoshihiro's eyes narrowed at the display, having barely noticed where the attack came from. Once again, a shadowed figure appeared, morphing out of the flames like a specter, the harbinger of the deaths, several more shadows soon appearing at his sides, the red hood and mask becoming visible as multiple yellow eyes glowed next to him, the silhouettes of their SB becoming visible soon after. Yoshihiro gritted his teeth, taking hold of his war hammer before he stepped forward, his gaze never leaving the scarlet-covered ninja before him. Stay calm, boys, he's human just like the rest of us. Charge in and take him down. Yes, Tsuchikage-sama. The Anbu guard that had remained collectively spoke before they each drew their blades, rushing forward. Naruto stepped past the flames, his form now fully visible, obscured only by the slight distortions in the air caused by the heat. Looking back behind him, he grunted before he looked in front of him, extending his hand in the direction of the enemy. Receiving their master's signal, hundreds of snakes, most 3 times the size of a man, rushed forward, their hissing and screeching easily carrying themselves over the roar of the flames as they tore into the Iwa ninja. Snapping jaws, piercing fangs, and powerful tails their ranks apart. Fire and water techniques easily deflected by scales stronger than steel. Earth, lightning, and wind, easily evaded with sheer speed, belying their huge size. Naruto ignored the chaos around him, however, his red eyes trained on just one individual, who seemed just as impassive to the battle as he was. That was his target. Far behind the roaring flames, the Konoha ninja all stood, over the rooftops, getting as high as possible in order to see beyond the flames and towards the battle now taking place. There was confusion amongst most of the rookies in regards to who this man was, but that confusion was quickly dispelled by others who confirmed the man's identity. Many of the younger generation, those of 14, 15, 16 and so on, watched the battle with rapt attention. They had heard stories, tales of the sheer force of nature that this man was said to be, told by their parents to get them to behave. Each of them wanted to see the legend that was Konoha's Akasho, the Devil King, the man that could supposedly not be up close and personal. And this was their best chance to see it, without being at the wrong end of the line. Hinata watched on silently. It had been so long since she felt such heaviness in the air she had almost forgotten. She had expected for his skills to have somewhat dulled, having been behind a desk for the last 7 years. But he had certainly proved her wrong. His chakra, his mere presence was 10 times as oppressive, 10 times as intense as it had been before. She swallowed her sudden fear, but did not turn away. Whether the fear was of Naruto, or for him, she was not certain. She could never be certain with him. Never know whether she served him out of loyalty and respect, or simple fear. He always treated her and all of those he knew fairly, and with the respect each of them deserved. But here, on the field of battle, he changed. It was an obvious change, yet a subtle one as well. And no matter what side of the line you were on, the heaviness in the air was all the same, just as oppressive, and just as fear-inducing. Akamaru whined as he prodded the unconscious Kiba with its snout. The boy remained unconscious, his face pale and his breathing shallow as Sakura and Ino worked on closing the injury. The massive dog turned its head and growled at the sight of the red-clad man, easily recognizing him as the one who had harmed his master. Teeth flashed as he let loose a howl of fury and rushed into the fray. Hana's eyes widened, yelling as best she could with her broken ribs causing her more pain by the use of her lungs. Akamaru, stop. The beast ignored her, however, rushing past ninja and snake alike. Dodging and weaving between fangs, masses of flesh, bones and jaws. It was like a tunnel vision, his only target being the man in red. Powerful jaw muscles coiling beneath fur-covered skin as he prepared to snap down onto the man's head with as much crushing force as he could manage, which would easily be enough to make it explode like a melon. The beast movement was brought to a sudden and brutal halt, however. It choked, releasing a strangled whine. His voice apathetic as he spoke. Worthless. Before he threw the dog to the side, its head against a brick wall with a sickening crack, slowly forming a pool where its head fell on the floor, the red liquid easily mingling with others around it. Damn you! Ino suddenly roared before she too rushed into the fight. No, wait, Ino, you troublesome woman. Chuji and Shikamaru called after her before they too ran. Temari watched each of them go, keeping her head in the fight and not allowing her emotions of fear, of both the individual approaching them, and for her friends to cloud her mind. She was willing to wait for the right time, when he was distracted, in which to strike. Hana felt her stomach lurch at the sight of her brother's long-time companion get tossed aside so callously. Yeah? Sakura questioned back as she moved to her side, already running a diagnostic jutsu over the older Kunoichi. Wincing silently at the damage. 3 snapped ribs, with 4 more cracked ones. Luckily, even with all the movement the Inuzuka girl did, none had punctured a lung. She was about to order the older Inuzuka to pull back and retreat with the rest of the Iwa shinobi when Hana's voice interrupted her. Sakura, I need you to repair my ribs. The young pink-haired medic looked back to Hana seriously. I can't do that here. That sort of procedure is extremely delicate. You have to isolate the bone fragments, make sure the marrow doesn't reach your bee, make sure the bones themselves don't shred your insides. Not to mention the pain would be almost unbearable without morphine or something similar. This isn't something that can be done in the You either do it now and get me well enough to fight that monster, or you don't do it and I fight him anyway. The woman ground out through her teeth, wiping some bee from her mouth. Sakura shook her head. I don't even know a medical technique advanced enough to do this procedure here. You need the proper facilities. B. Hana roared as best she could, smelling the lie on the younger girl. Sakura cursed. She did know a technique. Chiyoba-sama and herself had come up with it. It combined medical chakra and puppeteer artistry. They would channel healing techniques into the body through chakra strings, and use those strings as little feelers to repair damage or snap bones back into place with precision. It was truly a brilliant piece of work, and both Sakura and Chiyo were currently looking for a way to apply it into an offensive technique that would be able to destroy the insides of the person instead. But it was difficult, because chakra strings themselves were a brittle thing at best and needed complete and total compliance from whatever it was they were trying to move, hence why they were only used in inanimate objects, which offered no resistance except that of their own weight to any proposed movement. Still, Sakura knew that using this technique, which when it began to take effect would be extremely painful, on a live patient would be difficult unless Hana moved as little as humanly possible. She could end up doing even more damage than what she already possessed if she moved around too much. Still, the girl looked determined, so. Sakura nodded hesitantly. Fine, but you have to remain perfectly still no matter what. The Inuzuka girl nodded before she took a deep breath, and braced herself as green gathered around Sakura's hands. Naruto's slow trek through the chaotic, fiery battlefield around him was brought to a sudden halt as a shadow connected with his own, his eyes glancing down slowly, following the blackish trail to its owner, a face he could easily recognize as the son of Shikito. Nara, he whispered as his chakra slowly started to spike. Shikamaru breathed heavily, sweating in exertion as he felt as if he was holding back a hurricane with an umbrella. Never in his life has he ever felt such a sheer magnitude of power. He wasn't even sure how much longer he would stand if he kept this up. Soon enough, however, there was a blur of movement next to the red ninja. Before it could, however, the Jinchuriki's eyes flashed a deep shade or red before his K-intent sword. Shikamaru lost control of his shadow technique, the thin tendril retracting to the shadow user who fell to his knees, along with many of the Iwa shinobi around them, turning them into even easier targets for the snakes still feasting over their corpses. Ino, who was closest to the man, felt the full force of the powerful wave of K-intent. She collapsed, her stomach contents spilling to the ground at their feet, her eyes momentarily losing their focus as she fought to retain her consciousness. A knee was planted firmly in her face, sending her falling onto her back in a daze. Ino, was the cry of worry that reached Naruto's ears. Glancing up, he found a massive fist, nearly twice his 6'3" size, heading straight for him. Holding out his hand, the blonde didn't even form hand seals before he spoke as Chuji's hand was about to reach him. Futen, show her. A shockwave tore through the area, buildings collapsed, the ground shook at their feet. The dazed Ino was easily blown away by the attack, Temari barely reaching her in time to catch her. The shockwave of compressed air vibrated up Chuji's arm, the sheer air pressure exerted by it was enough to slow his fist to a near-crawling pace, barely managing to feel the cloth of the Devil King's red cloak before the sounds of crunching and snapping bones tore through the air. Chuji's eyes widened before he howled in agony, his technique dispelling itself as he clutched his now thoroughly broken arm. Naruto's hand returned to his side, before he again continued on his singular path towards the Tsuchikage, who still stood silently at the other end of the road. Daikamaikatchi. Temari yelled out, swinging her fan in wide arc, sending hundreds of tiny spinning wind blades towards Naruto, hoping the attack would at least distract him enough for someone else to take any opening he might leave. Just before the attack connected, the 20-year-old cage vanished, allowing the tiny crescent-like blades to see apart one of the snake summons behind him, the creature vanishing a moment later in a puff of smoke. Temari felt a cold chill run down her spine, the hairs on the back of her end stood on end as her highly trained ears picked up the faint sound of breathing behind her. Her eyes barely catching the edges of his red coat from her peripheral vision. She drew a kunai and in a lightning-fast motion tried to swipe at him. Only for Naruto to backhand her across the face, sending her tumbling to the floor, her fan knocked out of her fingers and disorienting vertigo settling over her mind. Naruto drew a kunai, rearing his arm back as he prepared to throw it and end the Kunoichi's life, when something gripped his wrist firmly. Slowly he turned his head to find the form that towered over even his own. The smirk over Yoshihiro's face was one that spoke of confidence, there was still a veiled uncertainty within it. Now that's not very nice, he said before he quickly formed a fireball in his free hand. Shikamaru, who had been watching from a bit of a distance, was forced to cover his eyes as another explosion sent dust and debris flying through the air. A blackish blur flew from the dust into a building with bone-breaking force. As the dust around the initial area settled, it revealed Yoshihiro, looking towards the area where Naruto had been blown into, his gaze serious as he unsheathed his hammer. Soon enough Shikamaru regained his bearings and made his way back to the Tsuchikage, Chuji joining him a moment later along with Temari and Ino, the Wind Mistress being supported by the other Kunoichi as she had not yet recovered from the brutal hit she had taken. You didn't get him, did you? Shikamaru questioned after a moment of brief silence. If I did, I'd be very disappointed. The Tsuchikage spoke with a partially false bravado as he smirked. I wouldn't. Temari groaned, rubbing her head in pain. A crash brought their attention back into the opening in the building as the crimson-clad body emerged, a single blade held loosely at his side as he stepped over the shifting debris at his feet. Yoshihiro eyed the burn on the boy's body armor, slightly below the ribs, he could faintly see through it, to the skin, which was healing rapidly. Yoshihiro's eyes narrowed. That would most certainly be a problem judging by the near-regenerative speed it was healing at. Naruto's red eyes passed over each of them as he stepped forward, calling out 3 specific names as he approached. Nara, Yamanaka, Akamaiki. He sidestepped another attack from behind, allowing his attacker to pass him and land near the group of assembled ninja, revealing Hana, Sakura appearing next to the group a moment later as well as she formed another healing technique, over Chuji's arm. Inuzuka. He finished, before his wrist twitched, and flames formed over the entire length of the blade in his hand. He stopped, the group surrounding him in a semi-circle. Isn't this a somewhat familiar setting? Don't expect it to have the same outcome, Hana snarled. Naruto's shoulders rose in a shrug. It won't. I K them quickly. Zhuge slowly unrolled the scroll delivered to him by his scout, his eyes traveling over the kanji within with a measured patience, as he did with all the scrolls in his library, the same one they were currently standing in. I see, so he is in Iwa then. He handed the scroll back to the scout and spoke. Very well, tell the commanders to assemble the men, then find Yugito and Akina, they are to be ready to march tomorrow along with everyone else. Very well, Raikage-sama. The man spoke before he vanished in a puff of smoke. Zhuge then walked over to the balcony, watching the sun as it rose above the horizon. Uzumaki Naruto, you have made your first mistake, and this one shall cost you more than just your village. Naruto stood before the ninja, each with their eyes fixated on him, a burning fire of revenge burning within most of them, the silent promise of him, ever visible. He looked to each of them, waiting for one of them to make the first move, and he wasn't soon disappointed, as the pink-haired one threw several kunai, each moving rather quickly through the air. Turning only slightly, he carelessly batted them away with a wave of his armored hand, the one holding his flaming sword, using his free hand to catch the Inuzuka's kick to his ribs a second later. He threw the girl off, ducking under Yoshihiro's hammer swing as he simultaneously spun back around, swinging his blade to strike the large man's leg, only to watch as sparks flew as his blade, wrapped in red-hot flames, his sword met tempered steel plate instead of flesh. Yoshihiro growled, moving to kick the boy only for Naruto to leap up, landing behind the Tsuchikage before spinning around again, only for his sword of flame to be caught by a fist of stone. Yoshihiro spun around, keeping his grip firm as he swung his own weapon with his free hand in a wide arc, aiming for Naruto's side. To his and everyone else's surprise, however, the blonde merely raised his own hand and caught the hammer's head, letting out a small grunt of effort as he tightened his grip over the weapon. Yoshihiro's eyes narrowed. He knew the boy was strong, but this was getting ridiculous. The Tsuchikage then noticed a few, however slight distortions in the air surrounding Naruto, and it only took him a second to recognize what they were before he was seized to pieces, vanishing in a cloud of smoke a moment later, revealing a log. Naruto went to move, but a shadow held him in place. His eyes traveled to the shadow user, Chuji appearing above him a moment later, his shattered arm held in a tight sling Sakura had made quickly to get him back in the fight. The Akamike visibly fought against the pain as his enlarged fist headed straight towards Naruto. The blonde allowed his eye to travel towards Shikamaru, who was again visibly struggling against the strain of keeping him still. The blonde's eyes flashed a brighter red again as his K intent flared. Shikamaru offered a moment of resistance before he collapsed again, leaving Naruto with only a single split second of time left to escape Chuji's attack as the Akamaki's massive fist down into the area he previously occupied. His speed made him seem little more than a blur as he made a mad dash towards the shadow user, ready to destroy what was most likely the most problematic of his opponents. Shikamaru. He heard the faint cry of worry reach his ears but paid little attention to the fools behind him, and focused solely on the Nara. When he was close, however, he saw the shadow wielder smirk before he leapt straight up, the earth exploding beneath him a moment later, revealing the Yamanaka girl, a dark smirk plastered over her own features as she looked straight into his eyes. She threw her arms wide open, letting out a loud screech, one that made Naruto stop his charge, clutching his ears in pain, and even the nearby Shikamaru winced as the scream reached a level that would burst eardrums. There was a pulse of chakra from the girl before she collapsed, being caught by Shikamaru before she fully fell. Naruto felt her presence enter his mind, growling as he struggled to fight her off, watching as his hand slowly went down to his kunai pouch. The others of the group watched on, as Ino's face contorted with pain as the last vestiges of her subconscious mind displayed the struggle her conscious mind was currently waging with the Jinchuriki. Each hesitant to attack, not knowing if this technique was like other Yamanaka techniques where the damage received in the vessel would damage the user's actual body. Naruto fell to one knee, his growls growing in volume as his hand tightened into a tight fist, and slowly, ran his metal-covered thumb over the golden wristbands, releasing a bit of his B through special openings onto them, watching as one of the 5 seals glowed and burned off before he gathered chakra, the burning feeling forming to the pit of his stomach and spreading out, a visible red haze forming over his body before it exploded outwards. Ino's eyes flew open and she let out strangled gasp as her mind was forcefully pushed out. She arched her back before the tense muscles relaxed and she fell against Shikamaru, panting and sweating as her eyes, still smoldering with deep hatred, passed back to Naruto, who stood back up, red chakra receding back into the seal. He glared at the 2 shinobi before he shot forward, the rest of the ninja behind him giving chase a moment later as they tried to catch up. Shikamaru drew 2 kunai, throwing Ino behind him as she had not yet fully recovered from the backlash of her own technique. Close combat and speed were never the shadow user's strengths, however, and Naruto was soon upon him. Red flashed before his eyes as he put up whatever resistance he could. In seconds the Devil King systematically disarmed him and delivered 5 solid punches to the boy's face. Shikamaru. Chuji roared, the fear for his friend almost palpable as he rushed forward even faster than before. Sakura appeared at the Jinchuriki's side, chakra scalpel in hand as she moved to thrust it into his K, only for her to catch sight of a minor distortion in the wind and pulled her hand back in time to merely receive a -C on her arm, instead of having it lobbed off entirely. Kamaikitchi. Temari suddenly yelled, launching her attack at Naruto's back, hoping to stop him. Naruto calmly turned his head, before he turned around fully, hefting Shikamaru by his end so the shadow user formed a type of human shield. He could easily K the shadow user himself and get out of the way, but using him in such a manner would not only anger his comrades, making them clumsy and careless, it may also make the wind using Kunoiki hesitate in the future. Temari's eyes widened. No, she yelled, looking at each of her wind blades. She extended her hands, forming what little chakra strings she could, and intercepted 5 of the wind blades, 5 that she knew would hit vital spots on the shadow user's form. Sakura, since she couldn't see the blades as well as she could, merely vague distortions of the air wouldn't be able to help. And so she, along with the others, could do little more than watch as the blades rush headlong towards the wrong opponent. Naruto waited until he was certain the full gravity of what happened had sunk in, before he callously threw Shikamaru to the side, watching as he rolled to a stop, unmoving, Sakura, giving the red-robed Kage a wide berth as she did the same, leaving Naruto to face the remaining 4 ninja. Chuji looked at the limp, unmoving form of his best friend. Blinding, bubbling rage which rose from his stomach, extending to every extremity of his body as he glared at the ninja. His anger growing with every passing second as he simply stood there, blade held firmly in his hand, completely uncaring, devoid of emotion, a blank slate, a void, a monster. Chuji could barely see straight as he growled, his hand into the ground, earth gathered around it, forming numerous spikes throughout his whole fist. He rushed the blonde, not even registering Yoshihiro's cry for him to stop. Naruto easily weaved around the attacks, watching as the large Akamaki swung his club-like fist around in his wild attempts to hit him, leaving several glaring openings in his defenses, one of which he swiftly took advantage of, appearing behind the Akamaki, his still flaming sword held firmly in his grip. Injuries that did not take a genius to deduce what produced them. The large ninja fell to his knees, before he fell to the floor entirely, his eyes closing as darkness overcame him. Foolish, Naruto muttered. Yeah, you are, came a familiar, cold voice from behind him. Turning, he found Yoshihiro, before the man swung his hammer, intending to crush his skull with the blunt weapon. As the weapon s his head to bits, spraying bee and brain matter everywhere, it was no real surprise to anyone that the blonde vanished in a cloud of smoke a second later. Kaiten, K's no Ru. The earth shook beneath their feet, and the ground beneath Yoshihiro slowly began to glow red-hot, slowly growing in size, and the old man only had a scant few seconds to react as he realized what was happening. Forming his hand seals and his hammer onto the floor, creating massive spikes to form all around him before they each convened over him. Forming a tight cocoon, a massive dragon exploded from the ground beneath his feet a moment later. The heat from the creature was by far the most intense any had felt before, and nearby wooden buildings nearly 50 feet away combusted along the edges closest to the rising flame dragon. Wind distortions along its length around it made it obvious to Temari's trained eye that it had also been imbued with wind chakra. She swallowed down her fear, watching as the beast coiled and twisted in the air as it hovered over the city, the stone cocoon caught within its jaws, visible cracks forming along it as the heat dried the earth until it was brittle and the wind seeped into its shell. Hana, Temari, Ino and Sakura watched in fear as more cracks and snaps reached their ears, each praying that Yoshihiro's shield would hold against the assault, but to their horror, the dragon's jaws snapped shut. Earth, burning red-hot, fell like the crumbs of a cookie from its mouth and against the floor, picking up dust and crushing anything unfortunate enough to be beneath it. The dragon of flame and wind roared again before it finally dissipated, but the heat did not. Much of the nearby buildings had been lit and the flames were now spreading throughout the city. Footsteps reached Temari's ear and she looked to where the dragon had initially rose from, and found the form which would now forever be one with her nightmares, rising as if from the depths from hell itself, the blade still firmly gripped in his hands. Naruto's hand suddenly reached out to his side again, stopping Yoshihiro's hammer strike with his bare hand. Turning his head, he looked at the face of the Tsuchikage. Naruto roughly shoved the man off, making him stumble. As the Tsuchikage regained his footing, he turned to Naruto, ready to defend, or deliver an attack, but it was to be for naught as the boy raised his sword and seized the air between them. Banka no Shua, he spoke the name of his jutsu, watching as Yoshihiro's eyes widened and his mouth opened, releasing a cry of shock and pain before flames swept over him, an explosion tearing up the earth at his feet a moment later, sending him flying back. Earth met sky as the man felt the war hammer slip through his fingers, the heat making his heavy metal armor feel as if it was cooking him for a moment before his form was finally thrown from the blast radius. He against the side of a building, wood, brick and clay collapsing over him as darkness consumed him utterly. Temari grit her teeth, settling herself in a defensive stance as Naruto turned his attention from Yoshihiro back to them. She spoke to the Inuzuka girl over her shoulder. Hana, we have to pull back, summon your nin dogs to get everyone out of here safely. As they would be Kei, and her brother still needed medical attention, as did Chuji and Shikamaru. Biting her thumb, she formed her hand seals and soon 3 large, horse-like dogs appeared around her in plumes of smoke. Get them out of here, I'll hold him off. Temari spoke again, taking a small, unconscious step back as Naruto began walking towards them again. I'm not about to leave. Just do it, the wind mistress yelled as she grabbed a scroll from her pouch, unrolling it. Its contents appeared in a plume of smoke, revealing another fan which the girl used to take to the skies. Hovering several yards above before she let loose with another volley of wind blades as Hana and her summons vanished. With a wave of his hand, the Jinchuriki manipulated the air around him, dispelling Temari's own wind blades before they ever got close. Allowing his eyes to travel skyward, finding her standing above another of her fans, the first one which she still held firmly in her hands, ready to release her next attack if need be. Forming his hand seals while the blade was still firmly gripped in his hand. Haseba. He finished his hand seals, spinning once to his right, followed swiftly by another spin to his left, his blade dragging across the floor around him. Sparks rose from the ground around him, a perfect circle. He shifted his stance, spreading his legs wide apart, holding his blade somewhat behind him as his clawed hand was held in front of him. Faint wisps of chakra visibly flowing from his palm, down to the earth beneath his feet. It can't be, she thought with horror gripping her heart as the chunk of earth the Jinchuriki was standing on was visibly pulled loose from the rest of the soil. A perfect, semicircular chunk of earth rose slowly, picking up speed the higher it got, and she was forced to accept that it was being held up by wind power alone. Her fan was built for this sort of use. Wind chakra flowed through and around it easily. It also caught the wind easily, providing lift with relatively minimal effort. It was also very light in comparison to its size. To lift a chunk of earth, which depending on the density of the stone could have weighed anywhere from 50 to 120 pounds with just wind pressure, it shouldn't even be considered remotely possible. The sheer chakra, and control over the wind necessary for that type of raw, brute force power was not even human. Not to mention the fact that he was not see the stone he was standing on. Naruto rose high above the ground, never stopping in his ascent until he was standing at eye level with the still shocked wind mistress. Temari gritted her teeth, unrolling another scroll, making her large fan, which she used as her primary weapon, disappear, before she unrolled another scroll. 2 plumes of smoke escaping this one, revealing 2 smaller bladed fans. These weapons provided a quicker succession of attacks, but much less power. It seemed her opponent was quite determined to meet her up close and personal, so she would have to hold her own with these. Naruto stared at the wind mistress, glowing red eyes meeting fierce silvery blue before his form streaked through the sky. Temari waved both her fans, sending more wind blade, which were again dispelled by the blonde Jinchuriki. For Temari, at the sight of such a thing, her hope of any victory at all was growing bleaker and bleaker. If he could still dispel her long-range wind techniques while manipulating such an extremely advanced wind technique to keep himself levitated, then this man was beginning to seem less like a human and more like the demon everyone claimed him to be. So fully giving up on long range, she snapped both fans shut, shifted them into a reverse grip, and formed 2 clearly visible blade-like extensions. She allowed herself to glance briefly towards her friends, who were placing Chuji, Shikamaru and Kiba onto Hana's summons, and could only pray that the Inuzuka girl would listen to her and run. The blade-like extensions to her fans were nearly a foot long each. She tightened her grip on them before she met his charge with her own. Naruto unsheathed his second blade, and see off his fire chakra from the first, channeling wind chakra into both blades as he met Temari in midair. Their chakra-formed blades clashing with howling sounds instead of the usual metal-on-metal. Temari looked from the corner of her eye as Hana and her summoned dogs leaped over the buildings and made their escape. Hana, with Ino's help, heaved Chuji's massive form onto one of her summons, Sakura placing Kiba onto another. Shikamaru was already on his own animal. She walked over to the animal who carried Kiba before she gripped his mane, and leapt onto him herself. Get on, we're leaving. But what about Temari? Sakura questioned with worry as she allowed her eyes to travel up to said wind mistress, as the Jinchuriki also rose up above the ground, standing on a floating stone platform. Hana growled, feeling torn between helping her friend and doing as she had been ordered. As she looked at the wind mistress, seeing her bravely stand her ground against the monster that had all but demolished them. She wanted to, oh gods how she wanted to stand beside her. But she knew that if she did not leave now, they would most likely be witnessing their last battle. Answer, turning, she ordered her mount to ride off, at full speed, praying that her wind-wielding friend would indeed be able to catch up to them later. Temari let out a startled cry as Naruto swung both blades. She raised her own wind blades, gritting her teeth against the force of the attack. She tried to hold her ground, but soon, the sheer power behind the Jinchuriki's swing threw her off her standing platform. Kaiten, Ryuka. Naruto spoke before he blew out a stream of fire through his mask, which quickly took up the form of 3 fire dragons which dived straight down to the ground, dispersing as they made contact in the unwavering surface, spreading fire throughout the whole courtyard at their feet. Temari's eyes widened in momentary panic as she beheld the sea of flames she was currently falling towards. But she soon recovered her level-headedness and opened her 2 small fans before throwing them away, manipulating their trajectory with a mixture of wind manipulation and chakra strings, placing them beneath her feet where she manipulated the air again and was soon hovering safely above the flames. She threw out another group of chakra strings towards her other larger fan which had also been falling to the inferno below before she yanked it towards herself, catching it from the air, snapping it open before she replaced it with the fans at her feet and looked back above to where Naruto should still be. But to her surprise the blonde was not there anymore and she merely found the now falling stone platform. She didn't need to wonder where he went for very long as she felt a weight which forced her fan to shift suddenly. Cold sweat dripped down her face as she swallowed a lump that rose in her tea before she hesitantly turned her head, daring to steal a glance behind her. Only to find the familiar red cloak and hood standing directly behind her. Temari ducked, narrowly avoiding the blade that passed over her head as she did. She spun around on her heel, her foot approaching the rather precarious edge of the fan as she did, attacking with an upwards S with one of her winged blades, which was blocked by Naruto's own. The Jinchuriki raised his other blade over his head, and swung, bringing it down on the wind mistress, who quickly raised her own blade to block. The force of the attack forced her blade down however. She didn't have too much time to focus on it however, as a kick connected harshly with her side, throwing her off her fan and into the tiled roof of a second-story building nearby. The Suna Kunoiki rolled onto her stomach, painfully picking herself up, ignoring the bee that escaped her lips as she painfully gripped her side. Her ribs were probably bruised from that last hit, breathing was becoming painful and the bee loss, from her shoulder, which was nearly twice as bad as it would normally be due to the extremely razor-like sharpness of the blade, was beginning to make her vision swim. There was a crash next to her, and she painfully turned her head, finding the familiar leather boots standing above broken and cracked roof tiles. Naruto watched the Kunoiki for a moment, observing her labored breathing and trying to identify the vague familiarity he felt as he looked at her. He really couldn't place it, but decided that because she fought and showed such familiarity with those escaped survivors of the genocide 9 years ago, that she was most likely from one of those families. Paying it no more mind, the Jinchuriki raised his blade above his head again, ready to bring it down on the girl one final time. But as his arm came down, there was a rumble beneath him. Shortly before the roof exploded from beneath his feet, a pillar of earth throwing him high into the air, disoriented from the sudden attack. Yoshihiro suddenly appeared above him, his battered, bruised and burned form breathing heavily. Nonetheless he reared his hammer back and with a mighty swing, it into the flying form of the Kyuubi Jinchuriki, sending him plummeting towards the earth, or rather towards another building which the blonde plowed right through. Yoshihiro formed several quick hand seals, strapping the hammer to his back before several fireballs formed in the palms of his hand. Pitching them into the hole the Jinchuriki made into the building, watching as a glow from within grew brighter and brighter before it exploded outwards, crumbling the building to dust as the attack enveloped it in a massive fireball. The Tsuchikage landed next to Temari, ignoring the pain coursing through his body as he lifted the girl to her feet, holding her until her legs again supported her standing form. "Get out of here, kid, I'll hold him off. Bu. No buts, this was Iwa's fight, never yours to begin with." The old man spoke firmly. Temari nodded weakly before she unrolled the scroll holding another spare fan. Stepping onto it, as she sent one last glance to the old Tsuchikage before she took back to the skies leaving the trade city of Sakai behind. Soon after she was gone the Tsuchikage was forced to shield himself from flying debris as a massive, freak tornado blew through the area where he had thrown the Kyuubi Jinchuriki. Yoshihiro tensed as he unclasped his hammer from his back again taking up his fighting stance as he prepared for the Kyuubi Jinchuriki to emerge from the smoldering rubble. But Naruto did not emerge from the collapsed building, instead the blonde exploded from the floor behind the Tsuchikage, wood and shattered tiles flying everywhere as twin, wind-empowered scimitars were already mid-thrust. Yoshihiro's eyes widened in alarm, realizing too late that the ninja had merely used the tornado and debris as a diversion. He wouldn't have time to dodge or replace himself with something. Gritting his teeth, the Tsuchikage closed his eyes, awaiting the inevitable pain. Coughing up the Tsuchikage tried a blind swing behind him with his hammer, only for the weapon to be kicked out of his now feeble grip as Naruto twisted the blades within him. The blonde, though he would never admit it, was impressed with the cage. Unlike what he had previously seen from the cage of Kirin, the leader of Kusazaraki, this man was not only strong, he also placed the lives of his ninja before his own. He reminded Naruto of Sarutobi somewhat, who would also rather be the first to than to abandon any of his ninja. He had seen him let the blonde Kanoiki escape, opting to stay behind himself, and even when he ordered the retreat, he could have easily left his top Anbu or some other lieutenant behind to pick up the slack. Instead he had chosen to stay behind himself. Not only that, for a man his age he was incredibly durable, being able to withstand 2 of his more damaging techniques, as well as 2 swords in him, and he still was not S. Yoshihiro let out a dry chuckle, B spilling from his lips. Damn, ain't this a B? I developed a technique in preparation to face you, but I never got a chance to use it. He looked over his shoulder, his B teeth making themselves known as he smiled at the Jinchuriki. Well, I guess, if I got a S, it's nice to know I'll be K by the man who sought out to conquer the world. Pulling out his blades, Naruto let the old man fall to the tiled floor in an armored heap, groaning slightly in pain. Naruto walked forward. But before he ever made the attack, a battle cry behind him brought his attention away from the downed cage. Spinning back around he blocked a spear thrust delivered by another Iwa ninja, this one with similar armor to Yoshihiro, but certainly much younger than the cage. Several more Anbu arrived around him, each throwing down smoke bombs. Naruto knew what they were after, and let them have it. It made no real difference now. Iwa would be his in a matter of days. As the smoke cleared, Naruto watched the Iwa Anbu leap back over the wall, their leader carried with them before he turned and began walking back to his own camp. This battle was done, he was the victor, and even though Yoshihiro put up an impressive last stand, he too fell, and Naruto was now one step closer to fulfilling his ambition. Yoshihiro chuckled some more, coughing up even more B as he was carried over the rooftops. A slow drizzle of rain beginning to fall over the city. Don't worry uncle, we'll get you back to Iwa soon. Toyohisa spoke at his side comfortingly. Yoshihiro looked to his nephew and was about to chastise him over his stupidity when he saw the boy's eyes. Soft brown eyes that grew hard with determination as he rushed forward, spear held firmly in hand. He looked every bit the shinobi Yoshihiro had always wanted him to be. The old man smiled, nodding to himself before he let his head to slump forward, darkness creeping over his vision as he allowing himself to close his eyes. He could rest now. Meanwhile in Kumo, Yugito sighed in contentment as she laid along the length of a tree branch, one arm hanging limply off the edge as she rested her head on the other. You know, for someone who claims they're nothing like their tenant, you certainly don't make much of an effort to live up to that. Came Akina's voice as she finished her warm-up exercises, walking over to the tree and standing under Yugito. The Nibi Jinchuriki scoffed. Oh, shut up. Indeed, her likeness to her tenant was a sensitive subject to her. Her ears were pointed, and her green eyes held a strange edge or glint to them which could seem very similar to that of a cat, as well as her larger-than-normal fangs. These distinguishing features, which to many men would make her seem exotic and all the more beautiful, were often subjects of children's teasings when she was younger, and so were a very sensitive point for her. But still, resting above treetops and, essentially cat-napping was one of the few indulgences she would admit most likely came from her feline tenant. Akina smirked, ready to tease her a bit more when a messenger suddenly ran up to them, breathing heavily. Yugito-san, Akina-san. Rikage-sama requests your presence immediately. Yugito groaned, leaping off the tree and landing next to the other two as she looked to the messenger. Did sensei say what he wanted? Is it another scavenger hunt or training regiment? Akina questioned as she bit back a groan. Zhu Liang had a very interesting way of training them both physically and mentally. He would not allow them to eat, unless they completed the training. The scavenger hunts were a series of riddles, which were all made by Zhu, and so were very complicated and difficult. Sometimes the two girls would have to go 3 days without food by how difficult these riddles were. His training regiments, whenever he came up with them, never had them starving, but it made them beg for a scavenger hunt when he gave them. Obviously, neither option was one the girls would be overly excited about. The messenger shook his head. No, I don't think it. I was hoping I'd be able to take out 2 of them with one swing. The one with white hair spoke, loudly to himself. His partner saying nothing as he looked to the 2 girls. Yugito and Akina's mouths suddenly felt dry as they each quickly identified their attackers. Akatsuki. Naruto arrived shortly at the slightly damaged Konoha encampment, ignoring the rain that began to fall over them, slowly growing in intensity. The wounded were being treated on portable bedspreads along the street, under some cloths that served to shield them from the cold rain, by whatever medics they had. the recruits still fit to fight standing guard, all parted to make way for him as he entered. Many of the younger recruits staring at him in awe as he passed, mutters passing over the crowd, their voices drifting through the air and into his ears, unbidden by the distance. It's him. What power, he just forced Iwa to retreat over the wall on his own. They say he's the Jinchuriki for the Kyuubi no Kitsune. I don't care what he is, with that kind of power it's no wonder Kiri, Taki, Kusa and Am are under him. They say he's the strongest ninja since the Yondaime Hokage, they say he can't be K. I don't doubt it, I mean did you see Ta? Naruto ignored the foolish muttering of the green Chunins, coming to a stop in front of Hinata, whose injuries were being treated by a medic, who was now staring upon him, frozen. Shino stood at her side, uninjured. Hinata looked back up to him, her blank pale eyes serious as she nodded once in greeting. Naruto-sama, thank you for saving me earlier. Your thanks are not necessary. He spoke calmly, the deepening effect of the face mask making his voice, once again seem all the more hollow, sending chills down Hinata's spine. It had been so long since that cold flat voice was heard in such a way, even Shino seemed to shift from one foot to the other in unease. Naruto turned his eyes to Shino, or at least seemingly did since one couldn't really tell without his eyes being red. Aburame-san, are you uninjured? Shino nodded. Yes sir, from what my Kikaichu have gathered, Mika-san and Tenten-san are also uninjured, Tushiro-san is taking care of a minor injury along his arm. Naruto nodded. Good. Take your men, and advance over the wall. Now that Yoshihiro is defeated, I want you to break their stranglehold. He paused for a brief moment. Quote. A few minutes later, several hundred yards outside of the camp, Naruto stopped, allowing his yes to travel skyward, the dark gray clouds blocking out the sun, the black smoke from the flames rising to the heavens as cold rain fell from it. How strange. The Jinchuriki spoke to himself, pausing as he reflected on the situation. It rains, the very same day I returned to the battlefield. Just as it rained the eve of your deaths. He looked down to the bee-soaked gauntlet that covered his hand, as the rain slowly cleansed it from its crimson taint. Is that you, weeping for me once again, Yoshino? He lowered his hand, reaching into his kunai pouch as he took out a butterfly pendant and redwood prayer beads, the gifts he had given him so long ago. Flames danced before his eyes as he blinked. The same words he spoke to himself, and to their spirits nearly a decade ago returning to his mind, drifting through it like an echo in the wind. Flames consume only what can be touched. Your souls shall remain with me. Turning with his bee-red robe sweeping behind him, he placed the items back in his pouch as he made his way back to the camp. I alone shall shoulder the sorrow. That is all. The rain fell harder. That will be all for this video. Be sure to like, subscribe, share, and comment down below for more videos. Goodbye.